Hello and welcome to a brand new series for our small groups. For the next 3 sessions to take us up to Easter, we're going to be looking at the story of some of Jesus' disciples. We're going to be looking at some in our morning services, and the ones that we might otherwise have missed, we're going to pick up in these small group sessions. We've called this series The Apprentice because we recognise that discipleship and being a Christian is not about a destination that we reach or have reached, but it's about this constant journey of learning and discovering and growing closer to Jesus, trying to walk more and more closely with Jesus every step. And we reckon that some of these disciples that we're going to look at teach us some really powerful and really significant things around that theme. So today we're going to be looking at the character of Matthew. This character is introduced to us in all 3 Gospels, in Matthew chapter 9, in Mark chapter 2, and in Luke chapter 5. And if we were to read those passages, we would discover that each Gospel writer describes a story in the same way. They all come in the same place in the timeline. 2 of the passages, the ones in Mark and in Luke, refer to the character as Levi. Matthew's Gospel refers to the character as Matthew. We reckon that the story is of the call to follow Jesus that the author of Matthew's Gospel receives. We also think that his original name was Levi, and his name was changed by Jesus to Matthew when he was called to follow Jesus, much in the same way that Simon Peter had 2 names, and all sorts of other people through our Bible have a couple of names that they are described by. We don't need to dwell on that too much, other than to say what we reckon is, whether they're referred to as Matthew or as Levi, this person was one of Jesus' disciples, and we think most likely was the author of Matthew's Gospel, although we could have a bit of an argument about that if you were so inclined. We know that he was a tax collector, so he had lots of material wealth, and we also know that he has a very immediate response to Jesus when Jesus calls him to follow him. It describes Matthew as leaving anything without much hesitation. We don't hear of or read of any sort of prior relationship between Matthew and Jesus. It's pretty likely that Matthew would have known about Jesus, but we don't read of any sort of conversations or interactions before this moment. But Matthew almost instantaneously decides that he is going to leave everything behind to follow Jesus. And that was a big deal for him. He had a well-paid job. That would have had a decent amount of status attached to it. But what we don't read in these passages is that there's any sense of mourning for the life that he was leaving behind. Rather, what we read of, actually, is Matthew throwing a huge banquet almost straight away afterwards, which feels like a bit of a celebration of the life that he has chosen to step into. We often read of the disciples leaving everything behind, and I think, certainly for me anyway, that makes me think that they completely detach themselves from their life before. Whereas what we see of Matthew is that he leaves his wealth behind, he leaves his job and his status behind. But the first thing he does is throw this big banquet, this big celebration for all of his tax collector mates. And he invites Jesus and his disciples into that space. He doesn't leave those people that were in his life before behind. He invites Jesus and his disciples into that social space, believing that Jesus would be able to transform and minister to and bring new life to those people that Matthew knew and was mates with. So we find a situation where Jesus isn't just standing at the front of a crowd and teaching people who you might class as sinners. But in fact, in this story, for the first time in the Gospels, we read of Jesus sitting down for a meal with tax collectors and sinners. The Gospel writers sort of lump those 2 in together. Read into that what you will. He's not just stood at the front of a crowd teaching, but he's sat around a table. There's fellowship in a lot more of an intimate way. Sitting down for a meal together is a different level to what we've seen of Jesus' interaction with people up to this point in the Gospels. And the Pharisees really didn't like that. They didn't like Jesus anyway, but this new development of his heart for people and the way he was going to do ministry on the earth, they were perplexed, they were confused, they really couldn't wrap their heads around what Jesus was trying to do. The Pharisees wouldn't have been at the meal because they'd have been too worried about mixing with people who were unclean and then becoming unclean themselves. But they would have heard that this would happen, and they might have been able to see that it was going on. The houses were pretty open during that time. The Pharisees are still pretty scared of Jesus. So when they question him, they do it via his disciples. As I said, this whole idea of Jesus interacting around a table with tax collectors and sinners was such an alien concept for the Pharisees that they just couldn't wrap their heads around it. And so Jesus hears the Pharisees' questioning of the disciples about what Jesus was doing, and he responds with words along the lines of, it's not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick. There's a bit of a rebuke of the Pharisees wrapped up in that phrase and wrapped up in that comment. They had such a high opinion of themselves, but Jesus didn't quite agree. The Pharisees clearly saw themselves as very healthy and well, but what we see of Jesus is that he came with a different set of standards that probably definitely the Pharisees didn't quite match up to in terms of health and wellness. Matthew includes this line that Mark and Luke both omit. He says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." That's a quote from Hosea that we'll come back to, but again, a real pointed message to the Pharisees. The Pharisees see themselves as well, as healthy, as righteous, but not by Jesus' standards. Jesus says to them, "For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And in Luke's Gospel, he adds the little phrase on the end, to repentance. "For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." This passage, the story of Matthew's call to follow Jesus, feels like a bit of an overview, a bit of an outline of what Matthew was choosing to leave behind in choosing to follow Jesus. In his former life, he would have been driven by wealth and status, ego, and maybe a sense of self-righteousness. But here Jesus demonstrates that his way is exactly the opposite of all that, and makes some pretty pointed remarks about the Pharisees' faults in this area. The quote from Hosea in Matthew's account points us towards a discipleship that wouldn't be about box ticking, but instead would be value-driven and people-driven. Compassion and mercy over all self-preservation. No longer not mixing with people for fear of becoming unclean, but instead getting stuck in with the sick and the sinful and calling them to repentance. The idea of turning away from what has been before and stepping into a new life and a new way of being, inspired and guided by Jesus Christ. Matthew's Gospel was written to prove that Jesus was the fulfillment of all that had been promised and all that had been prophesied through the Old Testament. Why? So that people like these Pharisees, who were so dismissive of Jesus, but also dismissive of those who were outcast in society, those people who were on the fringes, so that people like that, who were so troubled and frustrated and perplexed by Jesus and his ways, would find a way to repentance, and through that find a way to new life with Jesus. Matthew serves as a reminder to us that call to repentance doesn't go away, that we have a desperate need for Jesus, the Messiah who doesn't just teach from a platform, but sits down for dinner with us and gives us a way to find wellness and righteousness through him. So I'd encourage you to sit down in your groups, maybe go back over the passage that you read right at the beginning, and there'll be some questions on the screen as well to help you have some conversation to dig a bit more into what we might learn from Matthew the disciple.